Good evening and welcome to Bronx Talk. Tonight's show is about a four-letter word, guns. To get us started, I want to show you some hard, cold steel numbers. This is going to give you an indication of exactly what has been going on in our country as far as guns. This is for the first 2 months of 2023. Mass shooting incidents, 93, that's more than one a day, all across the country. 37 children were killed from age 0 to 11. 93 children were injured. Teens 12 to 17, 246 teens were injured. And police officers who were killed or injured, 59. Unintentional shootings, I repeat, 245. Murder-suicide incidents, 115. The total gun violent deaths in 2 months in the United States of America, almost 7,000. And that's from the Gun Violence Archives. Now, the locations of those 93 mass shootings in 2 months is nationwide, whether it's at a college in Michigan, a street in Memphis, Tennessee, an apartment complex in Lakeland, Florida, a mall in El Paso, Texas, or even in a Popeyes restaurant on East Tremont in the Bronx. There is one common denominator of every one of those shootings, mass or otherwise. It's not mental illness, it's not anger, it's not despair, it's not poverty, it's not domestic violence, it's guns. That's what every one of these shootings have in common. Tonight we're going to talk about prevention and legislation, including the various constitutional issues involved. Please join me in welcoming here in our studio the Director of Community Outreach for Stand Up for Violence at Jacobi Medical Center. It is Pastor Jay Gooding. Nice to have you with us, Pastor.
Good to be here tonight, Gary.
Thank you. And on Skype, he's all the way out in the Dominican Republic, he tells us. It is the state senator from the Bronx's 32nd Senatorial District. He's the chair of the Senate's Committee on Cities, the Honorable Louis Sepulveda. Senator Sepulveda, we got you. Nice to see you today.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to this very important segment.
It is important because it's, my frustration is through the roof. I think a lot of people feel the same way. Let's start with you, Pastor Gooding, here in our studio. Describe SUV, Stand Up to Violence. It's been around a little while. What is the approach to addressing gun violence at SUV at Jacobi Medical Center?
Well, at Jacobi Stand Up to Violence, we've been now for 9 years. We're in our 9th year, and we have 4 components, basically. We have a hospital component, we have an outreach component, we have a community component, and also a social component. The hospital component deals with whenever someone is shot, being that Jacobi is one of the #1 trauma centers, we're alerted, and our hospital responders are alerted to make sure that they get to the victim and try to make sure that there's no retaliatory shootings.
So at least you got the one, which I guess we're going to deal with, but then you're going to make sure that that one doesn't lead to something else.
Exactly, because that's the main thing, is that we're trying to stop the retaliatory shootings. So they try to speak to the young man to try to calm him down.
You say young men, it's not always that way, but
exactly,
it could be.
Exactly, yes. And women, you're absolutely right. And then we have the community piece. These are outreach workers, former young men and women who used to be out there in the street, used to be the gun carriers, but now they've transformed their lives to try to tell the young people, put the guns down.
Does it work?
It does. It does.
And how do you know? I'm assuming there's some measuring statistic.
We've had a matter of fact, we're in Senator Sepulveda's district also, and he's been a great supporter of our, give us resources and grants. We've had a 50% reduction in gun violence in our catchment areas.
Wow.
Yeah.
And what neighborhoods are that?
We're located in the 4-9 precinct, certain boundaries around Pelham, in Eastchester, and then we're also in the 4-7 precinct. We go up the White Plains Road corridor, and then in the 4-3, we cover Bronx River Houses, Stratford.
And you say in those areas there is a 50% decrease.
Yes,
over what period of
over the
time?
9 years
Over the
period,
9 years.
Yeah.
What does it take to do it? Is it funding? Is it? You talked about manpower. I mean, what do we need to do this?
It's really our outreach workers having a conversation with young people. What we do, you'll be surprised, Gary, about the youth that have not even been out of their neighborhood. So at Jacobi Stand Up to Violence, our outreach workers take some of our participants, we take them to places they've never been before, outside of their block.
Like where? Like to Broadway or something?
Broadway to the Knicks games. The Knicks are winning
Oh,
right now.
I want to go.
Yeah, the Knicks are winning
Especially
right now.
Yeah, we all want to go.
Hopefully to the Ranger game,
Yeah,
you know.
right. And you do that, and you say it transforms lives.
It does. You'll be surprised, as I said, that the young folk that have never come out of their community.
You know, I remember years ago I had a conversation with the director of the PSAL, the Public School Athletic League, and every athlete has to attend school in order to play. And he said, I have 26,000 athletes. If you doubled my budget and got me twice as much funding, I'd have 52,000 students in school.
I believe it.
Same kind of thing for you?
Yes.
And so a part of it is a matter of funding. Can it be duplicated? Can other organizations do this or learn the tactics?
We basically have. You have the Cure Violence site. Now we have expanded that. We are part of also the crisis management team under Mayor Adams. And matter of fact, when you look at guns, we're part of the SNUG program that's funded by the state, and it's SNUG. The SNUG program is just guns spelled backwards. So we're trying to change the trend.
That's a different sort of four-letter word. I want to ask you, which we're going to do afterwards. I want to bring the senator in. He's out there in the Dominican Republic. We want to make good use of his time. But you were telling me about some of the people that you have conducted funerals for.
Yes.
We'll talk about that in a moment. Senator, let's just address one thing right off the top of the bat. Guns coming into the Bronx and New York City, in many cases, are coming from elsewhere. Is there anything could be done locally about that, or that is really a federal thing? And then, of course, we know what the dialogue is in Washington.
Well, first of all, Gary, I get it. The Reverend, his program SUV, there are other programs like Guns Down, Lives Up, where we have allocated to the SNUG program a few $1 million this year to combat gun violence. We're working with the governor's office. But the reality is that very little can be done in this current environment. We passed a series of bills to control the issue of gun violence in the state of New York. But in the disastrous decision by the New York Pistol and Rifle Association versus Braun, the Supreme Court, in its infinite wisdom, held that we have very little room to pass sensible gun control legislation in this country. So anything that we do, we have to measure it against a Supreme Court case. And that just god-awful case is going to create more problems here in New York because guns aren't manufactured here in New York. Guns are manufactured primarily in red states, where, by the way, these Republicans who call themselves a law and order party, except they're against law and order when it comes to gun violence, it is these states that have the highest level of gun violence in the country. It's not New York. It's mostly the red southern states where they are fanatics of the Second Amendment and torture the Second Amendment to the decision that we have now primarily by Trump appointees of the Supreme Court that have opened the floodgates to more issues. And that's where you're going to see, I believe, even more mass shootings and more violence or crime involving guns because they have left us very little wiggle room. Mm-hmm. Some states, in fact, I can't remember the state, yesterday passed legislation that's going to allow concealed carry on college campuses. That is absurd. But this is what we're facing now with the current environment in the Supreme Court.
You know, I pulled this photograph off social media, which I want to show. I know that Rebecca has that photograph. There was a picture of a guy coming out of a supermarket, armed to the hilt. Now, the joke that somebody posted said he survived the dairy aisle this time. This to me is just I can't even imagine it. You brought up the Second Amendment. I want to put it up on the screen and let you. This is the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Are the people who are saying, you know what, we are entitled to have guns because of that sentence in the Constitution, are they interpreting it correctly?
Oh, that's the logic. We don't need militias. The Revolutionary War is over, and that was a byproduct of us fighting the British, where we wanted to make sure that they retain our arms in case the British decided to invade this country. There was no automatic weapons. You don't have the technology and weapons that you have today, that you had back then, that you have today. It just makes no sense. But Gary, I'll tell you one thing that I think would have an immediate impact. That is, if black and brown members of this country sign up with the NRA and walked around with guns, that you'll see how they'll start putting restrictions on guns in this country. That's the cure.
I'm smiling. It's very sad to even consider that. One of the things, and I shared this with Pastor Gooding before we went on the air, I noticed in the State of the Union address when President Biden said we want to lower mass shootings in America, only half of the room applauded. People who are interested in allowing concealed carry and everything else, they don't want to stop mass shootings. I mean, I can't follow it. Doesn't make sense.
Gary. There's no logic to it. Look again. Look where people think that New York has a problem with violence and crime and guns. Go to the southern states where they're so permissive, and that's where you see. Go to Jacksonville. Go there. That's like the OK Corral. These states where they have these open carry guns and are such fanatics to the Second Amendment are creating a problem for us here in New York and in the Northeast, because the guns are manufactured there, and then they bring them here to New York and get in the hands of our young people. That is the main problem. Unless we have another United States Supreme Court composition shortly, I don't see an end to the violence anytime soon.
Wow. I guess that's it. The show's over. I took a look at, because some of the criticism of states like New York, excuse me, show that they say, regulations don't work. I looked at the Pew Research Center's numbers. The states with the lowest deaths per capita, according to the Pew Research Center, are Hawaii, Massachusetts, New Jersey, Rhode Island, New York, Connecticut, and California. They have the lowest per capita death rates by gun violence. And these are the states with the biggest gun control. So you would think
that's correct.
You would think that that's a logical thing. The states with the highest gun death rates per capita are Mississippi, Louisiana, Wyoming, Missouri, and Alabama. So I think that's pretty much confirms, what you were saying. So, excuse me.
Listen, I was having a debate with a Floridian the other day who was being critical of New York's gun crime and violence issues, and I said, you know what? Florida is much worse than New York State. And so therein lies the problem. These southern states controlled by Republicans are creating a problem for us here in New York.
And I know that the governor feels very strongly, and many of our your colleagues in the legislature feel this way. So in June of 2022, the governor signed a comprehensive 10-bill package. I want to show people what it did. It limited the purchase of semi-automatic rifles, barring body armor purchases, which there's your militia, requires micro-stamping of new semi-automatic pistols, requires social media companies to report hateful content. What is the status of that 10-bill package? Was that thrown aside by the Supreme Court?
Oh, absolutely. But you forgot to mention my bill, which is the ghost guns bill, which is actually a bigger problem in our community. So when you committed violent acts with ghost guns are that you can purchase on the internet, the pieces, the parts. It's like a puzzle. When you put it together and you have a gun. With the issue of if you committed a violent act with a ghost gun, you would just charge with a violent act. The charges were increased because you weren't using what would be traditionally a gun. Well, my legislation says that ghost guns will now be considered. The use of a ghost gun in a violent act is just like any other gun, and it'll accelerate the charges of it'll increase the charges and the penalty to individuals that use ghost gun. But you're right. Most of this legislation now is unconstitutional pursuant to the Braun case. We wanted to restrict people using guns in Times Square. We cannot do that anymore. We're creating an environment where someone can go to Times Square and kill 1,000 people in 5 seconds. The Supreme Court case is a major blow to what we did in the state in June.
I made a list because then in January of this year, the New York Concealed Carry Improvement Act listed all the places where guns were prohibited. And I just want to list it, which to me makes total sense. You can't have a gun in courts or governmental buildings, in healthcare facilities, places of worship, libraries, public playgrounds, public parks, and zoos. Also in childcare facilities, homeless shelters, schools, public transit, bars, cannabis dispensaries, sporting events, polling places, public events and gatherings, and as you mentioned, in Times Square. One of your colleagues, Senator Brad Holman Siegel, has pushed for tougher gun registrations. He said dealing with the courts is like a game of whack-a-mole. Every time we try to do this, they come up with something else. And
That's
the
correct.
Times talked about it going back and forth like a ping pong match. One gets appealed, one gets passed. This judge says this. Is there further action to make sure that that legislation stands strong? I mean, is there something to be done?
Well, look,
or are you ready to say, well, we can't do anything about it?
Well, I mean, look, it's not just Senator Holman. It's also many senators, especially those that represent Black and brown communities, that are trying to control gun violence in the state of New York. But it's very difficult. If you read the Braun decision, you see how expansive it is on Second Amendment rights, that anything that we do is going to be measured against that. And look, I want to be hopeful. You know, I'm one of those believers in really funding our educational programs, housing, health insurance, and I think that's the best way to control violence, rather than lock them up and throw away the key nonsense that we read a lot about now. And I think that'll go further in terms of minimizing, mitigating gun violence. But with this decision, it's right. It's whack-a-mole. We don't know. I mean, we'll pass legislation, and then somebody, normally from upstate New York, from a red area, will then file an appeal, and we lose, and then we got to start again. We cannot give up hope. I mean, it's our children, it's our families. But the Supreme Court decision has made it extremely difficult for us to navigate these waters. And again, I am so worried about what to expect in the future because of that decision.
Let's bring you back into the conversation, Pastor Gooding. You were telling me about your personal experiences and what you've had to do. And so talk to me a little bit about what you've seen and how serious this problem is.
Yeah, well, I pastored 2 churches here in the Bronx, on Gun Hill Road and the Miracle Revival Temple Church on
Okay,
McCombs Road.
let's give credit to where credit is due. The Fellowship Tabernacle on Gun Hill Road and the Miracle Revival Temple on McCombs Road.
Yes.
Okay.
And also, I'm a eulogist. And over 29 years, I've done over 4,000 eulogies.
4,000?
4,000
For
eulogies.
people killed?
2 today. I got 2 today I'm doing.
For people who were killed with guns?
Not 4,000 people who were killed, but out of that 4,000, I probably about 10% over the years have been
400.
Of gun violence.
Gun violence.
Matter of fact, we just recently did a funeral at our church for a young lady that was killed last Father's Day. She was shot last Father's Day, but she died. She passed away in October, and we did her funeral at the church, and I had to eulogize her. Her family now has joined the church. And I often say this, Gary, and I often have said this, kind of been my mantra, that when a husband loses a wife, he's called a widower. When a wife loses a husband, she's called a widow. When a child loses their parent, they're orphans. But there's no name for when a parent loses a child except pain. And we're seeing too many parents, and to be the ones that have to sit with that parents and try to speak comfort to them, it's a painful trauma even in my profession.
The senator talked about wanting to fund things like programs, you mentioned it earlier on, programs that get kids off the streets, et cetera. I recall that when Rudy Giuliani was mayor, he said, well, midnight basketball doesn't work. Does it work? Is that, in other words, would we see a reduction in gun violence if we put more resources into our community centers, into the YMCA and places like that?
Well,
or is it so highfalutin that people say, you know what, it's never going to.
I believe it's going to take a combination of things, not only with the centers, but also with education, also with our communities, economics. And I know Senator Sepulveda could speak to that. But that's going to be part of it. And I think the more young people learn, we was talking earlier about going to Clinton. One thing about when we went to DeWitt Clinton.
We should say we both went to
That's
DeWitt
right,
Clinton.
DeWitt Clinton. One thing about Clinton back in the day in the 70s, we had a camaraderie. with our peers. So we knew who our friends were. We knew who to stay away from. And I think that's what we're missing. Our society now, because I think social media have really played a major part in that have kind of separated us. We no longer have interpersonal relationships.
You know, I'm pulling my cell phone out of my pocket. We all have one of these. And I say these are the greatest communication devices we've ever invented, but we communicate worse than we ever had. And imagine growing up in this world. I mean, the kids had to, the last 2 years have had to look at computer screens. I'm going to ask you this, and then we'll ask the senator the same question. So it seems acknowledged, certainly by the senator, that we're not getting the guns off the streets right now. The legislation we're working on doesn't work. The pushback that people are saying, well, let's arm the teachers. Let's give them a chance so that if some lunatic, for whatever reason, bursts into a school, we have a chance to fight back. You like that? You think that's...
No, I think that's just adding more guns, and that's just going to add more problems to the situation. And what's going to happen, you have a whole lot of folk that will panic. And sometimes, we're talking about unintentional shootings. Now you really have that unintentional shooting, because I think just people panicking and just assumption. Nowadays, you're going to kill if somebody just argues, because right now we're in a society where we just have anger. We're angry now. This country is so divided right now that we're angry at each other. We can't get along. And so now you would just have misguided anger.
Boy, I wish we, it's like you take a Tylenol to lower your fever. I wish we could lower the temperature. It would be that simple, right? Senator, 4 in 10, the Pew Research Center says 4 in 10 adults say they live in a household with a gun. 4 in 10, wow. That's 40% live in a household with a gun, including 30% who say they personally own one. That means more than 13 million guns. Should we arm teachers, arm grocery clerks, and say,
Gary, that is complete nonsense. Look, there were in Uvalde, Texas, there were some people with guns that could have stopped the shooter sooner, and they did nothing. There was another mass shooting where an individual without a gun. This whole notion about only a good guy with a gun can stop a bad guy with a gun, just the data does not play that out. The reality is, if we start bringing guns to schools, it starts normalizing the use of guns in educational institutions, and I am 100% against that. In the communities where you see gun violence, I represent the poorest senatorial district in the state of New York, and these are communities that were historically underfunded. There was just historic racism in terms of providing the necessities for our young men and women, generations, to succeed. We got the worst teachers in the state. They were sent to the Bronx, whenever they misbehave in the wealthier neighborhoods. And we were grossly underfunded until recently, where we're starting to get money. We have to put a significant amount of money into these kinds of programs: education, health, housing. And it sounds like, we keep saying the same thing. But the data indicates that when you have this level of stability in a young person, when they have a good education, when they have housing and health, that they tend to do significantly better and don't get involved in this kind of violence. So that's what we have to focus on in the interim. And, also the issue, I know that you indicated that the common factor is a gun, but there is a lot of mental health problems. And luckily, the governor has dedicated about $1 billion to help with that. Gary, about 40% of those individuals that are in Rikers, for example, are suffering from mental illness. I think over 37% of those that are incarcerated in state facilities are suffering from mental illness. And they're not going to get better while they're there. You look at the violence in the train stations. These are individuals that are suffering from mental illness. Luckily, the governor, the mayor are starting to have recognized that and are going to put significant funding into that aspect. But we have to really devote more resources to our children, to our schools in Black and brown poor communities, and that's where you see a significant impact in terms of gun violence.
I appreciate that you came back to the words that I opened the show with. I wasn't suggesting that these things don't exist. I was looking for the one common denominator so that we could focus on the implement that's causing all of this, and certainly the mental health part of it is major. Do you feel confident that the money's, $1 billion is a lot of money, that it'll be spent properly and in ways that will actually affect a number of problems, but this particular problem?
Gary, I've been speaking directly with the governor about this issue because it's very important to me in my community. And I'm confident that she's going to do the right thing. The funding's going to get there. I'm going to be hyper vigilant to make sure that the funding gets in there. I spoke about the story of mental illness in my family. My mother suffered from mental illness. She was depressed. She committed suicide when I was 11 years old because they didn't have the resources they have today. And so to me, it's extremely important that we get those resources out there to help people that are suffering from mental illness and may resort to gun violence. So you got to be hopeful and you got to keep pushing.
There are many organizations that work in our schools. I think that's a very big piece to this, to make sure that each school has a counselor or counselors to deal with troubled youth. Last question for you, Senator. The mood in the legislature, do you hear the same kind of pushback on gun legislation that we're hearing nationally? Let's say from people on the other side of the aisle, or are New Yorkers generally understanding that we've got to work together and do some of the things you've been suggesting?
I mean, you get a combination of both. Look, I have some colleagues, Republican colleagues, that are more moderate, that understand that things have to change. And then you have those that carrying a gun can be, a good health practice for them. Yeah, I mean, that's how insane it is sometimes. But you get it from both sides. But again, Gary, the number one problem was the Braun decision, which came from New York State.
Senator, thank you so much. We certainly appreciate your time. I know that you've been, he's down in the Dominican Republic. He's wearing a tie. He said he's been working down there, and we do appreciate your time. Let's conclude with you, Pastor Gooding. What would it take to expand the work of SUV? You named some of the precincts in the Bronx. Yeah. How do we get them in all the precincts in the Bronx? And frankly, I care about the Bronx, but what about the whole city?
Well, the state have been, SNUG have been doing a terrific job down through the years. Now we have the crisis management team from the city, Mayor Adams, and I know this is one of his main priorities, dealing with him, that he's concerned about, and what you just said is getting into the schools. I'm a firm believer, Gary, that if we can reach the young people, and this is when Joe Thompson, who's the head of the community council of the 409, first asked me to come aboard, the first thing I thought of was, let's get into the schools, the public schools, not the high schools, not the junior high school, but if we can reach them, the second, the third graders, and plant that seed. And I think as we begin to just get that message across, that's what's going to make a transformation.
I don't want to say that I invented this quote, but the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. I think fear plays a lot of it, because then people say, well, I need a gun to defend myself. Right. If we can, again, lower the temperature. Listen, Pastor Jay Gooding, thank you so much for your work and for your passion for the borough of the Bronx. And we appreciate you joining us here. Maybe the dialogue can help. That's why we do it.
Well, that's it, Gary. And I appreciate you having me on. It's been a long time since I've been on. The last time I was on, we both had black hair. And
there you go.
It was a little bit longer.
Maybe the next time we won't have any. We appreciate your time. We thank our producer, Rebecca Hemick. Our director is Nicholas Marrero. We thank the cast of thousands who are here working with us in the studio. And you know what happens on BronxTalk. We'll see you next week. Good night.